The fire was built too slowly to be called a fire. It wasn't meant to kill her, not at first. It was meant to unravel her, piece by piece. Before the smoke ever touched her skin, they stripped her name, her sword, her hair, her sainthood. They bound her hands in front of the crowd, not to restrain her, but to display her a lesson dressed in flesh. The priest leaned in and whispered, "Forgive me." But it wasn't to God. It was to her, and she didn't answer. Birds vanished from the sky that morning. Not one flew over the square, as if even the dumb creatures could smell what was coming. The soldiers looked away when they tied her to the stake, not out of pity, out of fear. A girl who had spoken with saints was now gagged by firewood, and the crowd, they said nothing, not even the faithful. When the wind turned cold, her skin cracked before the flames touched it. Her breath came in gasps, not from pain, but from knowing this was not a death. It was a ritual, and they called it mercy. She once crowned a king, in a cathedral filled with gold and trembling voices. She stood in armor before princes and priests, her banner raised higher than their doubt. But that memory belongs to a world that no longer claims her. Now she kneels in a stone cell that stinks of damp straw and male breath. Her hair is gone shaved like a penance, or a punishment. Her name is no longer Jeanne. They call her the heretic, the witch, the liar. Each title is a thread unwinding the myth they once needed. Her wrists are blistered from iron. Her voice is hoarse from prayers no one listens to. The saints who once spoke to her now say nothing, or perhaps they still speak, but only in silence, and only she can hear. She is not falling, she has already fallen. There is no sword in her hand, no vision in her eyes, only the sound of footsteps coming down the corridor and the endless scratching of quills writing down her words, twisting them into weapons. When they interrogate her, she does not weep. She watches, and that terrifies them. They see no madness, no hysteria, only the unbearable calm of someone who has already accepted the end. Her judge does not see a peasant girl. He sees a mirror, and he flinches. The myth of Joan the saint, the savior, the warrior maid, it is being stripped from her like mail torn from a corpse. What remains is just a girl, hungry, tired, listening to voices no one else believes in. But she will not ask for pity. Pity is the final collar, and she has worn enough chains. They began with the armor. It was the first to go, not physically that had already been taken in battle, but symbolically. They questioned it in court, interrogated its meaning, pressed her on why she had worn it at all, as if the chainmail itself was guilty, as if steel could defy scripture. Did you dress as a man to mock God, they asked, over and over, never listening to her answers. They didn't want truth. They wanted confession, and not the holy kind. Her body became the battleground now. Not Orleans, not Rams. Her body, her shape, her clothing, her skin. Everything that had once made her untouchable was now subject to touch, to suspicion, to scrutiny. The men who surrounded her didn't want understanding, they wanted ownership. The war she had fought in was not over, only redrawn, and now it was being fought in whispers and parchment. She sat before rows of judges who had already decided the ending. They asked if her voices were devils in disguise. They asked if the Archangel Michael had lied. They asked if she had sinned by obeying visions that men could not see. And she tried to answer, not for herself, but for God. Her words were calm, measured, but still. They twisted. Still, they rewrote her. The quills never stopped. Days blurred into each other. Night brought no rest. Dreams turned into traps. Even silence was considered rebellion. They accused her of pride when she looked them in the eye. They accused her of deceit when she closed them. Once, a letter came smuggled in on the underside of a bowl of soup, scrawled in charcoal on rough linen. It said only, "Hold fast." France remembers. She didn't cry when she read it, but her hands trembled. They confiscated the scrap. She never saw another message. The only voices now were the ones in her head and the ones they forced her to hear. The prison cell was colder than any battlefield. Not from weather, but from absence. There were no comrades here, no banner, no mass, only chains and questions. Her guards rotated often, not for duty, but so that none of them would start to pity her. Pity was dangerous. It softened executioners. One night, a young jailer left a crust of bread on her cot. She broke it in silence and gave thanks out loud. The next day, he was replaced. They said he had become compromised. Another time, she asked for a piece of cloth to bind her chest to protect herself from the men. They denied her, then mocked her when she dressed in trousers to avoid exposure. It was a trap. If she wore a dress, they threatened her purity. If she dressed as a man, they condemned her again. Everything she did was used against her, even prayer. They wrote down the rhythm of her breath when she spoke to the saints. They called it muttering, raving, evidence. Each night she folded her fingers in prayer, and each day they unfolded them in interrogation. Her cell was not empty. It was crowded with suspicion, with unseen eyes, with the pressure of 1,000 invisible judgments. Then came the recantation. It was the final trick. They offered her mercy. They said, a chance to save her soul, if she would sign, if she would kneel, if she would surrender the voices. They placed the document before her, thick, inked, pre-written, not a confession, a script, a verdict disguised as repentance. She asked for time. They denied her. She asked for clarity. They called it defiance. And still, she held for days until they brought her outside to the courtyard where the stake already stood, half-built, waiting. The wood was fresh, the rope still coiled like a snake at its base. She stared at it for minutes. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The fire spoke for them. That night, she signed. Her hand shook. The ink smeared. They called it done. She was pardoned for one breath. Then came the reversal. They said she lied, that her repentance was false, that the voices had returned, that she had dared wear men's clothing again. They didn't mention they had left her no other garments. They didn't mention the guards who taunted her nakedness. They didn't mention that this was the plan all along. Once she signed, she was theirs. Once she bent, she was broken. The second trial was shorter, crueler, colder. They no longer questioned her, only condemned. The word relapsed echoed in the chamber like a curse. A relapse of faith, a relapse of obedience, a relapse of silence. Her final sentence was spoken without pause. She would be burned, publicly, in the market square, where bread was sold, where children laughed, where life was meant to unfold in peace. They would turn it into a stage, and she would be their drama, not saint, not soldier, not even woman, just smoke. On the night before her death, she did not sleep. They say she stayed awake in prayer, not pleading, not bargaining, just speaking to something, to someone, maybe to the saints, maybe to herself. One scribe recorded that she sang a hymn that hadn't been heard since the siege of Orleans. Another said she wept. Another said she laughed. The truth is, no one knows. They only know the silence that followed. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence before execution, before spectacle, before history burned her name into ash and called it memory. She did not fight the guards when they came for her in the morning. She walked, barefoot, hair uncovered. The wind was cold, the sky overcast, but no rain fell. The townspeople had already gathered, not in mourning, but in anticipation. They didn't see a martyr, they saw theater. The butcher brought his son. The baker stood with flour on his sleeves. Women watched from behind shawls, whispering behind their hands. Her stake stood in the middle of the square like a monument to obedience. She did not look at it. She looked at the crowd, not in accusation, not in fear, just in recognition, as if to say, "I see you. I know what you are." The priests offered her one last chance. Recant again, betray again, beg. She didn't speak. Her silence was a verdict of its own. As they tied her to the stake, the executioner avoided her gaze. His hands moved quickly, efficiently, but not cruelly. It was not cruelty she feared. It was ritual. This wasn't death. This was doctrine made visible. This was politics written in blood and fire. This was the church cleansing itself by offering her body as proof. Proof of what? No one could say. Only that she must burn, not to punish her, but to purify them. They claimed her death would silence confusion, but it only fed it. She had crowned a king, yes. But now the crown would watch her die and say nothing. That was the true betrayal. Not the rope, not the fire, the silence. In the final moment before the pyre was lit, she asked for a cross. A soldier, not a priest, handed her a crude wooden one made from broken cart wheels. She kissed it. She held it to her chest, and then she looked up. Not at heaven, at the windows, where people hid, watching, judging, weeping. She did not scream when the flames touched her feet. That came later. First, there was only smoke. The square was already full before the sun reached its peak. The market stalls had been cleared, their wood repurposed for the stake. Crates that once held bread now held kindling. The execution wasn't scheduled at night, like a thief's hanging, or hidden behind cathedral walls, like a noble's beheading. It was at noon, high sun, full crowd. It had to be seen. That was the point. This was not a punishment. It was a sermon. The townspeople didn't whisper as they gathered. They watched in silence, as if waiting for a storm to speak first. When the guards led her in, barefoot and bound, the crowd parted like a wound. Children craned their necks for a better view. Old women clutched rosaries. Some men removed their hats, not for respect, for spectacle. She walked with steps that did not tremble, not defiant, not resigned, something colder. The executioner chosen for her death was not the usual man. He was silent, gray-faced, anonymous, a tool, not a person, and that made it worse. There would be no error, no delay, no accidental mercy. His job was not to kill. His job was to follow orders. The fire was built with wet wood and dry straw, a careful mix. Wet wood smokes before it burns. Dry straw flares fast. The goal was not instant death. It was display. They tied her ankles first, then her waist. The rope cut into her skin. Then they fastened her chest, as if worried she might rise. Her hair, already shaved, fluttered slightly in the wind. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Not yet. The priest approached, scroll in hand, reciting the charges one last time: heresy, relapse, dressing as a man, communion with devils. The words echoed in the open square, but none of them landed. Everyone already knew the charges were not the point. The fire was the point. Doctrine required spectacle. Faith required fear. Her hands were bound in front of her, not behind, not by mercy, by symbolism. Christ on the cross had open arms. So would she. This was not coincidence. It was choreography. Even the ashes were planned. The executioner placed a torch at the base of the stake, not touching it yet, waiting. One nod. That was all it would take. One nod from the bishop. He gave it without looking. The torch touched the straw. The straw answered immediately. Flame erupted like breath held too long. But the smoke moved first. Thick, gray, oily. It rose around her before the fire did, and the wind turned, east, then north, then back again. The smoke circled, trapped, coiled. It didn't rise clean. It crawled into the crowd, into mouths and lungs. People coughed, but did not move. This was part of it. The suffering was not meant to stay on the pyre. It was meant to seep into every corner. The flames licked at her feet. She didn't scream. Not yet. Her lips moved again. Still no sound. Then something, a low chant, a prayer, fragmented Latin, Jesu, Maria. No one could make out the rest. The priest crossed himself. The guards did not. One nun fainted. As the fire climbed her legs, she looked upward, not to the sky, to the windows of the buildings above. Faces stared back, some hidden behind curtains, some in full view. None opened the shutters. No one shouted for it to stop. This was a city that had already decided what she was. To interrupt the ritual was to question its necessity, so they watched, silent. When the fire reached her torso, her voice rose not in a cry, but in a declaration. "I was not wrong," she shouted, or something like it. The flames warped the sound. Some heard "I forgive you," others heard nothing but cracking wood. It didn't matter. The moment passed, and the fire consumed her knees, her thighs, her waist. The smell changed. No longer straw, no longer smoke. Now, it was flesh, burning cloth, charred rope. A priest turned his face away. A merchant vomited quietly at the edge of the square. The crowd still said nothing. Her hands clutched the cross, even as the rope burned away. She held it, fingers blackened, skin peeled, but the wood stayed close to her chest. It did not catch fire until the very end. That was not miracle. That was timing. The executioner had soaked the stake and rope more than the cross. Intentional. So the crowd would see the moment of separation. Cross from chest, fire from flesh, symbol from source. When the wood finally caught, it broke in half. One piece fell to the side, and a child in the crowd picked it up before anyone noticed. He would keep it for years, hidden in a box under his bed. He would never speak of it, even when he grew old, even when they told him she was a saint. Her lips moved until the final moment. Some said it was a prayer. Others believed it was a curse. The truth was simpler. She was reciting names of angels, of saints, of places she had seen in visions. Her voice was hoarse, but her eyes were open. She did not beg. She did not scream until the flames reached her chest. Then she gasped once. A single, sharp cry. Not fear, not pain. Recognition that it was really happening. That this was the end of her body, if not her meaning. And then she exhaled. Long, steady, like letting go. The sound carried. It hushed the square. For a moment, the fire dimmed, then roared. By the time the fire reached her face, she was already gone. But they didn't stop. The executioner waited until the flames had reached the top of the stake. Then he added more wood, not to kill, but to erase. Bones could survive fire. Ashes could be gathered. The goal was to leave nothing, no relics, no pieces, no remains, only story and smoke. Hours later, when the crowd had thinned and the sky darkened, a soldier stood near the charred remains. He crossed himself, not from belief, from fear. The square was silent, but it wasn't peace. It was residue. Something lingered, not smell presence, as if the fire hadn't just burned a girl, but had awakened something ancient, something older than doctrine, older than saints, and less forgiving. The next morning, the ashes were scattered into the Seine, quietly. No procession, no prayer, just a cart, a shovel, and a man paid to empty it. He did not look down. He said nothing. The water accepted it all. No trace remained, except the smell. It clung to the stones, to the walls, to the market stalls that would reopen days later as if nothing had happened. But people would hesitate near that spot. Just slightly. Just long enough. And no birds would fly overhead. Not for years. The fire ended. But the silence it left behind did not. In Rouen, the market square returned to its function in days, the smell of scorched flesh replaced by roasted meat. The ash swept into cracks beneath the cobblestones. But some stains do not lift with water. Some sounds do not leave with mourning. The vendors who returned first felt it before they named it. A pause in the air. A wait. As if time itself had stopped breathing. Her name was no longer spoken aloud. Not by those who watched. Not by those who ordered it. Not even by those who lit the fire. It had become a curse. To utter it was to call the ritual back. So it hung in the air, unsaid but never absent, like incense in a desecrated church. The king she crowned, Charles VII, said nothing. His silence was the most complete betrayal. No decree, no pardon, no mourning. He let the flames take her, then turned his back on the smoke. For decades, he would rule the kingdom she helped him win, walking over the grave that was made for her and pretending it was not there. But fire does not forget. It burns into the bones of cities. In the years after her death, rumors grew like weeds, first among peasants, then in letters passed by hands that remembered. They said her heart had not burned, that when the stake collapsed, it fell whole among the ashes, that the executioner found it pulsing still, red and stubborn. He was ordered to burn it again. He did, but it would not blacken. It would not turn to cinder. So he buried it beneath the riverbank. Some said the river turned cold after that no child bathed there again, that fish avoided the bend, that the fog stayed thicker near the spot, as if even nature refused to forget. These were not facts. They were wounds that refused to scar over. The church was the last to speak. Decades passed. New bishops replaced the old. France shifted. England bled. Kings died. And still, no absolution. Only in whispers did her story return. A soldier confessed on his deathbed that she had never blasphemed. A clerk admitted the trial records had been altered. Pages were missing, seals forged, but the scrolls remained locked in archives no one opened. Until, finally, they had no choice. 100 years later, the church convened a retrial, a hollow ritual. Her ashes had been scattered, her bones erased, her blood dried centuries ago, but they needed to cleanse themselves. Not of her sin, but of their own memory. So they declared her innocent, not because they believed it, but because history had begun to turn against them. The people remembered what the priests had tried to bury, and that was dangerous. They did not say they were wrong. They never do. They said she had been misjudged, that her trial had procedural flaws, that her voices may have been divine, cold phrases, detached, legal, designed to cut truth into segments and bury them between lines. But even those words were enough to spark revival. Statues rose, paintings bloomed, hymns were written. Joan returned not as the girl who burned, but as the icon who stood before kings. They stripped her of fire and replaced it with light. They removed the screams and added halos. Her story was rewritten again, not by enemies this time, but by those who wanted her as symbol, not person. The myth reassembled itself, gleaming and bloodless. But those who had stood in the crowd never spoke, not even when the saints in Rome placed a crown upon her memory, not when they declared her a martyr, not when churches took her name. The butcher never confessed. The nun who fainted never told her dreams. The child who kept the cross under his bed never showed it. They lived, they married, They died, and the square remained. They say a scent lingered, not always, but sometimes after rain, in early spring, a sweetness that didn't belong to flowers, a char that didn't belong to cooking. It was strongest near the stake's shadow, though the stake itself was gone. People avoided that part of the square when they could, unconsciously, as if the stones there were warmer or older or watching. The English clerics who oversaw her execution returned home silent. Some resigned. One entered a monastery and never spoke again, not from guilt, from fear. What they had witnessed was not just death. It was unmaking, a ritual not of the flesh, but of identity. They had watched a kingdom purge its prophet, and prophets have a way of returning, not through miracles, but through memory. That was the true fear. Not that she was dead, but that she would rise again, not in body, but in story. Her village remembered her differently. Not as a saint, not as a martyr, but as Jeanne. The girl who had once chased wolves from fields, who talked to herself while gathering firewood, who rode a horse badly the first time she tried. They whispered her name at night, not out of worship, out of absence. She had not died there. She had not returned. And yet, they built a small shrine, a rough wooden cross, flowers in spring, candles on winter nights, not to honor her, to anchor her, to keep her spirit from wandering too far. Because the dead who die unjustly do not sleep. They move, they linger, they burn in silence. Centuries passed. Her image appeared in stained glass, on coins, in textbooks. But none of these showed the girl who screamed inside the fire. They showed perfection, grace, eyes turned heavenward, not the raw truth, not the crackling wood, not the smoke that entered her lungs before any flame. Her sainthood came without apology, without reckoning. The church claimed her, polished her, offered her as proof that it could change, but it never said why she had to die, or who made it happen. That was left out, erased again. The ones who did remember, truly remember, carried her like a shadow. Not in faith, in warning. They taught their daughters not to speak too loud, not to lead, not to dress as men. They told stories of girls who rose too high, too fast, and met the same end. The lesson was not that Joan was holy. The lesson was that holiness is dangerous, and that danger has a face, and that face is female. The flames that killed her warmed no one. They lit no path. They fed no hearth. They were built to erase, but even in that, they failed. Because you can kill a girl, you can burn her body, but you cannot silence the breath that was taken. It moves, in wind, in rumor, in prayer, in Rouen. The square remains. There is a plaque now. Tourists take photos. They read the inscription. Few linger long. No birds land there. The stone is clean, but under it, the silence still breathes. They scattered her ashes, but the silence at Rouen still breathes. Not in words, not in sound, but in the pause before morning bells, in the echo between footsteps on ancient stone. Time did not bury her. It recoiled. Her name is printed now in textbooks, etched into marble, sung in cathedrals, but none of it touches what happened in the square. None of it explains why the birds never returned. She died praying, and they called it justice. They wrapped the fire in ritual, in law, in holy robes, and it swallowed her like breath withheld too long. The men who ordered it slept in soft beds. The king she crowned ruled in silence. The priests grew old, and their God said nothing. But the fire remembers. It remembers the sound her bones made, the smell her hair left in the wind. It remembers the lips that kept moving after the skin began to burn. We are told she died for faith, for France, for heresy, for politics, But maybe she died because the world cannot stand a girl who listens to voices no one else hears. There is no conclusion, only the smoke and the space she never left.